lightning talks. First person to present a 10-minute speech will be George Bridgwater, a head of research from Animal Ask. Then we will have Ajdin Arnautovic, the executive director of VivaBiH. Then James Ozden with his 10-minute speech, director and researcher from Social Change Labs. And finally, Andrés Jimenez Zorrilla, the CEO and co-founder of Shrimp Welfare Project. After the lightning talks, we will have a Q&A. Please just, when you will ask the questions at the end, make sure to direct the questions at each speaker. Thank you, and please give a round of applause for our speakers.
Hi, so yeah, thanks for the introduction. I guess the place I'll start is talking about different, rather than projecting. Cool, I guess what I want to talk about today is campaign selection and all the opportunities available to us in the movement. The place I'll start is an area where everyone is obviously very familiar with, is the typical life of a broiler chicken, growing from a chick of 80 grams to an adult of over 2 kilograms in a very short period of 42 days. During this process, the birds experience numerous welfare problems at every stage, all areas that as animal advocates, obviously we want to kind of improve or stop the whole process entirely. This occurs for numerous different animals who experience their own unique problems. And then outside of this, this is all caged within the existing regulatory system from primary to secondary legislation and the way legislation is made. So throughout this whole system, we've got various policies available to campaign on, both from kind of primary welfare improvements to the broader system as a whole. When confronted with all these problems, obviously there are a lot of places we could start. But which changes would be the most significant to work on is a difficult question to answer, especially given the various levels of complexity we could address the problem at. Lots of animal advocacy groups historically have focused on the problems that are most salient and obvious to them. The examples being kind of early Victorian animal advocates who tended to focus obviously on like cart horses or stray animals. These are the things that kind of grab our attention rather than the things that may be most impactful. But given this complexity, how should we go about selecting our campaigns? Broadly, I think there are 3 things we should consider, some of which the movement is already kind of very familiar with and already does a good job of prioritizing based on, and others that I think are useful to think about a bit more deeply and could benefit from additional research. The first problem is obviously the number of animals, which as farm animal advocates, we're already doing a pretty good job of prioritizing based on working with layer hens, broilers, wild-caught fish or crustaceans, and even insects. The second problem is to work on campaigns that have the greatest possible improvement for animals. This comes in 2 ways, both in terms of the quality of life that these various welfare improvements can have, which is kind of based in animal welfare science. The kind of trade-offs are the kind of intensity of suffering versus the length of time an animal might experience a problem, which kind of life stage or area should we aim to address. The next issue with this is to think about kind of the strength of the theory of change, of various policy options we have available to us. This is particularly true in kind of higher level legislation or things we could do to change the way the regulatory landscape kind of functions as a whole. And here it's important to break down kind of how we think each policy mechanism will affect the whole system and then kind of test each step in terms of like evidence base for each step as well as kind of the expected impact we expect it might have. Another factor to consider here is kind of any flow-through effects potential policies might have. This does occur obviously with welfare improvements, where banning particular practices can have knock-on effects, but this is particularly true on kind of in higher level legislation and policy in general, where there are usually like a lot of knock-on effects of the policy that we should consider. Finally, obviously we need to consider the tractability of the article campaigns we're working on. Most of you have to be successful in your campaign to have the direct impact. There will obviously be other benefits of campaigns, even if they're unsuccessful, Maybe we can change the kind of Overton window for future campaigns, kind of change public opinion. But predominantly, we want to work on things that kind of change legislation or change business practices. Cool. So the first example I wanted to talk about when it comes to this is the case of meat taxes, which we investigated in the UK. The theory of change is kind of relatively simple. If you tax meat, people eat it less animals experience factory farm conditions. And initially, our research team was kind of very positive on this intervention, just because of the simple theory of change to reduce the number of animals. However, as we kind of delved a bit more in depth into the research, we found a lot of existing economic models that suggested the most likely variation of this policy, which is carbon or health-based meat taxes, would have a disproportional price increase on kind of larger animals such as cows, lamb, and pork. And when that occurs, consumers will tend to shift their purchasing behavior to relatively cheaper products such as chicken, which could increase the number of farm animals rather than decrease them, which was the initial expected effect of the policy. The second example of something we have had the opposite effect with additional research is lower welfare imports. This is only a problem in like a few kind of higher welfare countries where a lot of their consumption actually comes from products that are imported from abroad with countries with weaker protections. Obviously, the direct impact of this is evident very early on. If a country is importing half of its products from countries with less protections, there's millions of animals that could potentially benefit from this with a policy like this. But with additional research, we saw some additional benefits to a campaign like this, such as the support from farmers' unions. It being inherently protectionist means it could actually gain support from kind of the people that generally oppose everything we campaign for. Additionally, a common kind of reason for concern for improving welfare legislation is that if you improve conditions in the country, farmers will experience competition from abroad from producers who don't have to adhere to the same standards, potentially, shifting consumption just to products that are produced abroad at the same lower standards as the existing legislation. So something like this could potentially bolster future advocacy by removing one of the barriers to improvements. The third example I wanted to give is enforcement. This is pending publication. But there, I think a lot of advocates would be familiar with through undercover investigations is we find a lot of violations of existing animal welfare laws. Here, there are a lot of policy options available to us, from kind of increasing the size of penalties, inspections, looking into the way prosecutions are done. Here we conducted a literature review on a few different domains to see where broadly what policy mechanisms had the greatest effect on compliance. And to our surprise, it tended to be that the size of penalties was kind of less important for compliance, and the detection of crime and then prosecution was the more important kind of element in deterring. Broadly, to confirm this, we conducted a Freedom of Information request in the UK to see how various local authorities who do the majority of inspections, how correlated the percentage of farms inspected was with the compliance rate. And we found that the existing data was consistent with a hypothesis from the literature, resulting in us kind of concluding that inspections were the most important aspect for improving compliance. Our broader findings are that which policies or campaigns are most impactful to work on are not necessarily intuitive. And I think there are a few different points groups should look out for in general. One being substitution effects, as seen in the meat taxes, where consumers substitute for other products as prices increase or if you ban products. The other is weak theories of change, so we need to check that the policy mechanism we're trying to recommend actually leads to impact, and each stage has evidence that it leads to the next. And finally is like difficult implementation for producers. We should be looking at costings and kind of the logistics and kind of getting a good understanding of what implementing our asks looks like for producers on the ground. Broadly, if I can get people to take away one thing away from this talk, it's to consider your campaigns carefully, consider some of the common problems that potential campaigns can have, and kind of map out your understanding of the effects it will have and the flow-through effects particularly carefully. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you so much, George. Please, once again, welcome with a great round of applause, Ajdin Arnautovic.
Is this better now? Okay, so I have quite a lot of slides, so I'll just go really fast, so bear with me. So I would like to say a huge thank you to everyone who came, especially to all those great speakers who have been speaking during the CARE conference and made it so hard for last of us, especially me, to speak. What else should we say that is like innovative and good? So I would like to say a little bit about building movement from scratch, as VivaBiH, or VivaBiH as we love to say, is the first and the only vegan organization in Bosnia and Herzegovina that I founded. So yeah, I don't really love to talk about the organization or about myself, but I feel I should say just a couple of words so you can know a few words about me. So yeah, short introduction. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where vegan movement is pretty, like, not really developed. But yeah, I mostly come from human rights sector. I would say this is what was my first project. So yeah, I was involved with Dutch Party for the Animals. I was coordinator for the AV. I was Sentient Media Fellowship, and I was at a previous CARE online and at this lead conference for farmed animals in California. And I can see some people who I also met there, so that's really cool. And yeah, without further ado, I would like to say that our organization is pretty small. We have only like 5 people, and those 3 people are the ones that are working in office. So I would like to say about how did we build a movement from scratch, what did we actually fail. So some of it might be a basic a little bit, but some of you who are thinking about starting an organization, or if you're thinking about, like, if you're even in a HR or executives, what kind of the things it might be helpful to look at. So one of the reasons why we only fight for farmed animals, as I said, we're not like the animal rights organization that fights for all animals, even though we technically believe all animals should have rights, right? So as you can see, I think this is pretty self-explanatory, the graph used by animal charity evaluators, and I'm pretty aware that most of you are already aware of this. So as you can see, the farmed animal movement is pretty underfunded. So that's why we are focusing only on farmed animals, but of course we will shed a light on lab animals or animals used in entertainment. So I would like to say, yeah, as you can see here, during the prehistory, we didn't make such a problem when it comes to our planet and environment. But now I think it's pretty obvious that even the dogs and cats, including us humans combined, are not really as issue as the animals we basically create to feed ourselves. Also, yeah, the global mass of the farm animals is now 22 times the weight of all wild animals. So I think that the issues of wild animals is also pretty much related, if not the main cause of it is also farmed animals as well. So I won't talk about our vision and our mission, but I would just like to say that during the starting of our organization, it was pretty hard in a sense that we couldn't really do just as what every other organization is doing, especially when you're like starting the movement in your country. But the way we actually did it is basically focusing on people. And I know most of us are like focusing on a project. We wanna like do so many stuffs, like let's do this project, let's do this evaluation and all that, but that way you will eventually lead to the burnout, not only of yourselves, but also to your team. So I think it's really important to invest in people, and I know this sounds really basic, and it is basic, but it took me so much time to understand. And here, I would like to ask you a question: do animals have voice? It's also basic questions, but the reason why I'm asking you is this because, of course, we all know that we are their voice. And the Tobias presentation did resonate so much to me because I see some really great activists who burned out. And when I founded the organization, I worked completely free for 1 year. And while I was also a student, I still am. But it came to me so many times that like I should leave this. There's like nothing out of this. You can't really do anything. But I didn't give up, and we have made it so many great stuffs that I'll later explain. So I think that especially people who are in HR and executives have the highest burnouts. I didn't believe that, but that's really the truth. That's what statistics says. And I think we shouldn't give up, actually. I think if we have a really goal, we should really keep it up, because it can never be hard to us as it can be hard for the animals that we enslave. So where and how to start? Should we include all kinds of campaigns? Should we do diet change campaigns, welfare campaigns, legislative work, or only one of those? And I know I have been talking about this with some of you, but yeah, can we be abolitionists from the very beginning? I think, as I said, we can do it, and we can be if we want. But yeah, I'm not saying we shouldn't do welfare campaigns. We should, especially if we have evidence for that. But I think we should have some kind of start, right? So I think it's really important to listen to your target audience. I realized that a lot of nonprofits, not only even in animal rights sector, that they start organization and they just do what every other organization is doing. But that doesn't necessarily have to be effective, because some organizations like MFA, THL, or PETA are working like decades, and something that they have been doing like at the moment maybe is not really effective for us, that we are just starting. If we are doing, like, we want to do welfare campaigns, but public opinion and people or even companies won't really understand that, because there is not a public awareness of it. So what's our work based on? What we currently do are two things: public awareness campaigns and institutional outreach. Of course, we have a plan to scale up much more, but this is so far what we're doing. What we're doing when it comes to the public awareness campaigns are, of course, the billboards, all kind of, when it comes to the fish. The picture you see here was like one of the most famous campaigns, because like we had so many religious people talking about us, and even people from other countries. We do a bunch of different kind of events, like with caterings, with screenings. Yeah, we find them really effective. We also did, in the midst of the pandemic, thankfully we were allowed to do so, the vegan fair. We also do a lot of like, kind of like regional panels and webinars. Yeah, we don't only focus on like one topic, but try to reach out as many topics as possible, because I believe there's no general approach to like things, especially when it comes to the farmed animals. We also try to like do campaigns that are not really, that are for the animals that are pretty neglected, like making videos about what's going on in the bee industry, in the honey industry, sorry, and to reach out as many as possible youth people. And of course, yeah, the street activities that I personally love to do. And so yeah, we also supported the animal save movement in Serbia, in Novi Sad particularly. We created a local video where we actually exposed the local industry. We didn't really say which kind of industry it is because of safety reasons, but also because we don't want people to say, okay, I'm not gonna buy there, I'm gonna buy in another industry. So yeah, it was pretty, yeah, it has more than 100K views. We also did like a Veganuary, like Vegalution, because Vegodulka in Bosnian means vegan resolution. And we also do institutional outreach, and by this I mean we initially started to work with restaurants to include more vegan options, because you know, you can have like really awesome public awareness campaigns, but when someone goes out, they have no vegan options, so that's pretty problematic. So we have, we worked with schools and as well as some restaurants and hotels to include. We also did a first research of number of vegans in our country that recently just finished. So yeah, overall, in a nutshell, we have managed to do 4 outdoor campaigns, 80 cities. Like you can see all of this, I don't have to read for you. And as you can see, like quite a lot of online content, because the moment we actually started being very active was currently during the COVID-19. So we were really prohibited to do practically anything that is not online. So it was really hard for us to like see what is the effective, what to do that is not really like online. So yeah, we also had like, as I said, vegan challenges, as you'll have to say. We also started doing this stuff with like restaurants. So vegan challenges is, yeah, a lot of street activities, especially this year when we were able to do so. So I would like to say that if you are thinking about starting an organization, or even for those of you who are like smaller organization or like medium, I don't know, what you should focus on is that you should be a resource library. So when people join the organization, you should be the one who will be able to provide for them. And I know this might be really hard, but you should be the one who will provide for them when it comes to the like projects, finances, pretty much everything. And focus on 1 or 2 additional people who share your passion. And also, please don't forget that there are awesome free trainings that might be really helpful for you. And if you need like any resources when it comes to that, reach out to me later, that I will share what things really helped me in start. And I really think it's important to emphasize on big thoughts and small steps. So I think we shouldn't just do stuff because everyone else is doing it, but rather have a plan what to do. I know this is really basic, but I think it's really important to emphasize on this. And also improve your organizing skills. That's pretty self-explanatory. And never forget that not everyone has the same passion as you do. And I think this was a little bit problematic for me in start, because when I went vegan, I was like, especially when I entered the organization, I was like, okay, we have to do this, we do to do all those kind of stuff that I actually envisioned to, but you know, not everyone has the same passion. We should be more like motivating towards others people and not to just try to like burn them down, you know? And also, yeah, passion is important, so is the patience. And I also think it's really needed to elaborate what do you expect from people and what are their duties. So yeah, this is all self-explanatory, but trust me, most of the people and most of the organization, as far as I could research on, are making mistakes on the very, very same things, even like the biggest organizations. So some people just like, I didn't expect I should do that. I didn't know I should do that. So yeah, short Q&A session. I put it in this presentation, but I think we're not supposed to. So yeah, thank you for everyone. If you have any questions, reach out to me.
Thank you so much. Please welcome with, once again, great round of applause, Director and Researcher at Social Change Lab, James Ozden.
Oh, wait, where's this thing? Cool. Hello, can you? Yes. Oh, wow, that's very loud. Cool. Hey, everyone. My name is James. So in a nutshell, Social Change Lab is a new research organization that I started in about January. So there's 2 of us, and we do research into social movements. And the idea is, like, can we use the same principles that civil rights movements, suffragettes, marriage equality have used to basically progress their causes? Can we apply these same issues to animal freedom? And we're kind of inspired by the same ideas as effective altruism, in that we want to find the most effective ways to help animals. And even Peter Singer said on Friday, we need more protest-related research, so thank you, Peter. Cool, so yeah, relatively new, there's only 2 of us, so like, yeah, cut some slack. But basically, the things we have done in the last 6 months, we reviewed around 60 academic papers, focusing mainly on political science, some on sociology, some on economics. We conducted our own public opinion polling of climate protests, just because the climate movement is much more active than the animal rights movement in terms of size and like activity. So we're trying to learn from them and hopefully apply the ideas that can apply to animal freedom. So yeah, we work with YouGov, which is a polling company, and did our own bespoke polling. We interviewed some policymakers who work in DEFRA, which is the agricultural kind of department in the UK, as well as BEIS. And we talked to some academics and movement experts who had either like founded really influential movements or otherwise researched like political science, sociology, and the outcomes of protests. And we did some case studies. So yeah, and our whole methodology was like mixed methods. We think no one approach is like foolproof, because kind of researching these like difficult social impacts is like quite hard. So if we can find the same answer across a range of methods, that seems a bit more promising, hopefully. And yeah, the reason why it's complicated is that basically protests and protest movements, they have a range of impacts. It's not just like A leads to B leads to C, and it's not that simple. And even this is like massively oversimplified. But like some things that might happen is that maybe you change someone's mind, maybe that influences politicians, maybe that changes policy, and then that kind of leads to like positive impacts. And there's some feedback loops that could be there, but you could also influence industry, you could influence voting. So there's like a range of ways that this could have positive or negative impacts. I didn't actually put negative, but that's obviously also a possibility. Cool, so like some tangible things that we actually found that they actually do change. So policy, so there's some great work by some academics in Belgium. So what they did was they actually exposed 239 elected MPs to different kinds of protests and measured like how likely were they to support those policies, how likely were they to change their minds based on those policies, based on the protests. And like the caveat here is that these were like these were pro-immigration related protests. So again, there's the issue of like how much can we actually generalize from the immigration movement to animal rights. But ignoring that, so some things that did come out of that is like the most important thing they found by far, which I'll talk about, is numbers. So salience again refers to like how much they think of the issue. Position is how much they agree with the protesters on that issue, and action is will they actually vote along the lines of the protesters on that next kind of like policy vote. And as you can see, numbers was quite effective, and so the stars that represent how significant it was in terms of like statistical measurements. So yeah, 3 stars is like pretty robust, and 2 stars is still less than 0.01, and then nothing is like no impact. So as you can see, commitment had very little impact on politicians' minds. So the way that's like one hint that like maybe if you want to really show your commitment, that might not be as important as having a really big movement. But obviously that's easier said than done. Other things, public opinion. That's probably the most commonly talked about thing, and I think the easy way is to show this graph. So this is YouGov polling, so like very trusted polling in the UK, kind of highlighting how public opinion for climate changed around the XR's protest, Extinction Rebellion, in about 2018, 2019. So this is a huge jump, as you can tell, kind of during April 2019, where they had like this massive uprising, like thousands of people, like about 1,000 people got arrested in London, 1,000 people came down, and it kind of sparked this international mass movement. And there's now about like 1,100 groups in like 84 countries odd. And then, as you can tell, it wasn't a short-term thing. It went up and stayed pretty consistent on going up. Then obviously COVID killed things a bit, but then it kind of came back. So that's like some indication that these things actually can persist over time rather than being like short-term changes. And finally, I'm not going to hammer this point home, but corporate behavior. I think everyone knows here that the campaigning work everyone does influence corporate behavior. But again, there's pretty good evidence of that in the climate movement, whether that's divestment or anti-coal campaigns. And there's a bunch more stuff, but if you want to get more into this, there's a new report we put out last week that's 62 pages of all this fun stuff, so just check out our website. But other stuff is like movement building. So like it's a way to get new people into the movement, and actually like lots of volunteers want to actually get involved and do something, but you don't know like what can I actually do, and these kind of like more grassroots, I think campaigns can actually get people engaged and hopefully start things long term. And again, it can kind of seed new organizations as some movements have done. But I guess an important point also is like protests is just like one tool, and it comes in many shapes and forms. But most of the stuff we looked into is like movements that primarily use protest as a tactic. But in and of itself, that can be very different. That can be during COVID, is having all these shoes to represent the children that could die from climate change, as XR did. Or this could be a campaign that I worked on at Animal Rebellion, which was blocking McDonald's using this lovely paper mache burger we made and a painted clown car and like crazy people in bamboo structures. So you can do it in many different ways, but also it's just one of like a few different things you should do, not just that, i.e. like leafleting, community organizing, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the more interesting thing is, I think it's pretty obvious that movements have had impact sometimes, right? I think you have to be pretty weird to look at civil rights and be like, Martin Luther King was like a total nobody. Like clearly, him and the crew did some good stuff. So I think what the more interesting question is, what actually makes some campaigns more effective than other ones? So this report we're working on, it's coming out in a month or two, but you guys will get the hot off the press stuff, and I guess everyone online, so I guess everyone, but anyway. So the most important things, I think numbers, like by far, in like almost everyone we spoke to, every literature we looked at, numbers was just by in and of itself like the most important thing. But like along with that, also very close is diversity. So one thing we heard a lot was politicians are much more likely to act if your group seems diverse, in that, is it like young people, old people, professionals, like doctors, teachers, academics, students? But if it's just like the usual suspects, i.e. like crusty hippies with long hair, they're like, I'm not interested. So basically you don't want to do that. So as you want to be diverse. And the other thing is rapid response capacity. So when trigger events happen, i.e. George Floyd was murdered in 2020, and BLM had years of groundwork to actually organize protests all around the US, all around the world. And in the end, they mobilized 0.5% of the US population to take action, which is, I think, pretty incredible. So I guess, can you use these like trigger events to actually mobilize and catalyze public opinion to your favor? So basically that means lots of groundwork beforehand. And things that usually go badly. So violence, this is a quite controversial one. Whenever I say violence is like generally going to go bad, someone's like, but this one example. I'm like, yes, that one example is probably right. But on the whole, violence doesn't seem to work very well. It's a big no-no for public opinion, but it can put lots of pressure on companies. I'll chat about that. Internal governance. So I think an important thing is like, how can you scale? So I think Andrea had some good questions on leadership development. I don't think nonprofits are that different to movements in some ways. If you can't deal with conflict, if you can't deal with like leadership development, if you can't do feedback well, if you can't do compensation very well, you'll probably fail. And it's even more intense because you're going to go from 10 to 100 to 10,000 people in like maybe 6 months. So can you handle that? And external conditions. So this is something I've probably changed my mind on since I've been doing this work. Is I think external conditions are really, really like much more important than I thought. I.e., what's public opinion like in your country? Do you have allies in good places? What's your democracy like? Like, what's your opposition? What's your current incumbent political party? So I think these are actually really important things to consider if it's like the time to start something new. So we did some public opinion polling that I mentioned we commissioned about this group called Just Stop Oil. So like, as you can tell, they did pretty like disruptive and what you might call like extreme tactics. They zip tied themselves to a post. That's my friend Louis, great guy. So he got loads of attention. Like even my brother, who just is not interested, is like, oh my god, do you know this guy? He's so crazy. So everyone knew him. But also blocking tankers and blocking oil facilities for several weeks. So like lots of attention, quite disruptive, basically quite annoying overall. Yet, in our polling, we found that actually no one disliked the cause of climate change or supported climate policies less because of this group. So they actually, support for the group itself went down, but support for the issue didn't actually change. So you might say, in some ways, that means there was no negative consequences from doing this level of like extreme action, but also very few things actually improved. But the one positive effect we did find, which you can see in this kind of complicated graph, is people's willingness to get involved in climate action went up by a small amount, 2.6 percentage points, which is like 1.7 million people. So in short, people were more willing to talk to their friends and family about climate change, engage with their MPs about climate change, and go to a legal protest about climate change, which I think is interesting. But again, this is only reported. We don't know if they actually did it, but they said they would do it. So it's something, but still weak. But again, I think more interesting is that level of extreme wasn't necessarily harmful, which I think we hear that a lot in animal rights. That being said, we also did a case study into SHAC. So SHAC is Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, a campaign from late 1990s to early 2000s. They were trying to stop Huntington Life Sciences, an animal cruelty, animal testing lab in the UK. And we interviewed a bunch of people who had gone to prison for their actions, as well as academics who wrote about them. And one of the things they said themselves was like they went too far, in that things they did probably hurt the movement overall, i.e. they went to people's homes and often like scared kids and families, which looked really bad on the movement. They did property damage, which sometimes is okay, but if you do it like that, evil scum on a car, media can frame you pretty badly and you lose public support. And the worst thing was, it had so much government repression, is they brought in new legislation, people went to prison for like 5 to 7 years, and people were too scared to get involved in animal rights activism for several years after that, because it was just so intimidating. But that being said, they also had some amazing wins. For the first time ever, the UK government insured a private company, HLS, because no other company in the stock market would actually want to insure HLS. And they got over 200 companies to not work with HLS, and they actually had to move to the US. So all in all, also some pretty amazing outcomes. And yeah, a petition with 5 million signatures against HLS, which early 2000s I think is pretty bonkers. And that's like almost 10% of the UK population. So pretty impressive. Most important takeaways, yes. It's one of those really like lame academic endings where like, it works sometimes, we need more research. But literally, I think it works sometimes, but it's not clear if this applies to animal advocacy. I think there's lots of reasons why it may or may not. But I guess similar to climate, we're one of the few groups that advocate for other beings or like other parties. So I think that's quite relevant to us. So I think one of the key things there is we need more research. And I'm not just saying that because we're doing it, but like other people, please do it. And like, if you are going to implement some of these tactics, like, please measure it, please talk to us, please let us know how it goes. And overall, we think it can be useful, but also it has some downside risks. Like, you can have new legislation against protests in your country or activism. You can lose public support. You can just do crazy shit that doesn't go well. So, all in all, if you're going to do it safely. Famous last words. Next step. So actually, we're doing some public opinion polling around animal rebellion basically next week. So we'll find out if anything changes from, again, disruptive animal rights protests. So I think that'd be quite relevant. And then basically, we want to find out why some movements succeed. So most of the work has been on protest-focused movements, but we want to broaden out to general social movements. So yeah, that's future work. And if you're interested, check out our website, email me, or have a chat while I'm here. Otherwise, thanks.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, the CEO and co-founder of Shrimp Welfare Project. Please welcome Andrés Jimenez Zorrilla.
Okay, the clicker, let me see if I can figure this out. Okay. I already gave you a sneak peek. Can you hear me? Perfect. So, 0. This is an important number. This is basically the amount of attention, funding, talent, organizations, etc., that had been focusing on this problem until very recently. And it's still essentially that. We're kind of the rounding error of the rounding error of attention for everyone, including the animal movement. Oh, this is an old version. Okay. Well, more zeros, but now followed by some other numbers. So basically, almost 400 billion shrimps are farmed every year. And this is with very low confidence, so the numbers could be significantly higher than this. And you know, this makes it very important when you combine it with the 0 before. And these two numbers basically are what drove my co-founder and I, among other things, to start Shrimp Welfare Project with the support of charity entrepreneurship last year. Now, I'm going to do something cheeky in this presentation, which is I'm going to presume that we all agree that shrimps are sentient, but I understand that that's probably not everyone's position, so just bear with me. At the end, I'll give you some resources that you can go and read on our website, basically, where you can read a bit more about that. So now that we all agree that shrimps are sentient and that there are a lot of animals involved in this situation, you might ask yourselves, okay, but then what are the concerns that we may have around shrimp farming as they relate to the welfare of these animals, and what can we do about them? So this is one of the two of the main concerns that we have in relation to shrimp farming. The first one that I would like, I don't know if they switched order, but poor water quality. This is a very important topic. The water is the medium in which aquatic animals live and should survive and thrive, as you can imagine. So it's very important that the water is conducive to high welfare and health of these animals, because you know, if water is outside the specific ranges that a species needs, it can be harmful for their health. It can lead to poisoning, suffocation, etc. So it's very important that water quality is maintained for the specific ranges of each species. Not doing that can lead to many negative outcomes, which I'll talk about a bit more. Another important concern is stocking densities. This is basically the number of shrimps or post-larvae. I'll use the acronym PL, that's post-larvae, that's basically just shrimps in industry talk, but PL per square meter or per cubic meter, depending on the life stage, can vary, and depending on the system, can vary from 5 PL per square meter up to 500 PL per square meter. So it's a very difficult variable. It
It's very system dependent, but it has, and there is very little, research on behavioral and welfare-focused research around the preferences of these animals, for example, in the wild, and how they prefer to live, basically because no one has found it very interesting to study in the past. So we lack a tool to point towards, to say, from a 5 freedoms perspective, this would be the ideal stocking density for these animals. But that is not a defeat, because there is very strong evidence that everything else held equal, an increase in stocking density leads to poor welfare outcomes, including higher mortality, etc. So it is a very important variable for welfare. It's negatively correlated with it. And the biggest problem is that at face value, it is something that is, for farmers, the more animals they put in a tank, the more profit. So it can lead to wrong decisions from a producer to try to stock higher and higher in stocking densities in the pursuit of profit. But we are convinced that this is the wrong way to go about doing shrimp farming, and there are very prominent stakeholders in the industry that recognize this, in the sense that higher stocking densities can lead to higher mortality rates, as I mentioned, but also to more stress in general, which leads to compromised immune systems, more probabilities of disease, worse feed conversion ratios, etc. All very important variables for the profitability of a shrimp farming operation, which results in frequently losses to the farmers themselves. So this is a triple tragedy, because you have, on the one hand, shrimps that frequently die or become diseased. You have a lot of resources, water, land, etc., being dedicated to an operation that eventually results also in a loss to a farmer that can barely make ends meet. So there is things that can be improved, we are convinced, that are conducive to higher welfare, and that should, and seem to be, for some players, welcomed by the industry to address these high losses, multi-billion-dollar losses for the industry globally. Another welfare concern is the slaughter methods that are used. Here, what you see is how it happens basically in every single harvest that we have seen, but this picture is in India. What you see at the far end of the screen is a net with shrimps, where someone has dragged them out of a pond, put them in these crates where they're drained of water, so that they can then weigh them without. The intermediary needs to know how much shrimps they're buying to pay the farmer, so they drain them of water for a very long time, while the shrimps are obviously not being able to breathe. As you can, those crates are maybe half a meter deep, so they're all on top of each other, and then there's the workers that are walking on top of them. So the slaughter methods that are used today have a lot of room for improvement, to say the least. And fortunately, there's some technology that has been developed to address this. So electrical stunning technology prior to slaughter, and there are some players in the value chain of shrimp that are already addressing it. Particularly, Tesco is at the forefront of retailers addressing these concerns, and they're requesting some of their suppliers to electrically stun the shrimps before they're slaughtered. And there's a great presentation by the Tesco aquaculture manager that in case anyone is interested to listen to hear more about this, it's quite promising. So there are advances in technology that will address some of the concerns that we're very hopeful to see be extended further. Now, this is another welfare concern. The female shrimps are, for the most part, subjected to this practice, which is having one of its eyes removed. And the reason why this happens or the reason behind this is because the scientists have figured out that there's a gland that secretes a hormone that inhibits reproduction or egg-laying activity by the mature females, which basically, once removed, sends their metabolism in overdrive, and they start laying eggs very quickly and very predictively. So it makes easier the reproduction of shrimps, but thankfully now there's very robust evidence that this practice is not only bad for welfare, but it also can be bad for business. And we want to make sure that the industry realizes more and more. And to their credit, they are starting to address it very slowly. But essentially what's been found is that the offspring of ablated females like this are less resistant to certain stressors, like temperature variabilities and salinity stress, but also to some pathogens that are very, very negative to the industry, like white spot virus and EHP, etc. So it's in the interest of the industry as well to address this. So we are lucky that we believe that the industry has a real vested interest in making these welfare improvements, and the way we see ourselves is essentially as a facilitator of these welfare improvements and as a partner to the industry to address them. So these are kind of the ways that we expect to do that. I'm not sure whether I'm running out of time, but basically we want to more robustly establish this link between higher welfare practices and productivity and make that much more salient to the industry. And we have some indication that people are listening to us. We want to promote the adoption of these practices amongst the producers. We want to support transition, the consumption and the buying patterns of big corporates to transition their purchasing to these higher welfare produced shrimps. We want to support research, promote the inclusion of higher welfare in standards which are lacking or insufficient, let's say, and ultimately to improve the welfare and health of shrimps. That is all. Unfortunately, we don't have here the other slides, but what I wanted to mention is since these materials were presented, I also want to talk about some promising things. So I focus mostly on the problems because I first believe that we need to be convinced as a movement or we need to think as a movement whether species like these are worthwhile, which I am convinced they are, and I wanted to talk to you about it, but also that there are steps that it is tractable. We recently signed an MOU 2 weeks ago with a group of producers, processors, hatcheries, and exporters of shrimps in India who are responsible for about 1 billion shrimps per annum to adhere to higher welfare practices as defined by SWP. So we're extremely happy about that. And we see, this morning I was reading a tweet by a CEO of one of the biggest companies saying it's impossible that the question was, are we shrimp farmers or shrimp gamblers? And the industry itself is saying we cannot have an industry that has 40% survival rate. So I'm very hopeful that these problems are tractable and there's an interest for them to be addressed not only by our movement, but also by the industry itself. So in case anyone wants to get in touch with me, sorry I don't have the resources here, but I'll make sure that you receive them to read about sentience and other things that I wanted to talk to you about.
Thank you so much. We will begin Q&A shortly. We already have some questions prepared, but in the meantime, please make sure you go to Eventory app and ask more questions. First one goes to George. would you say the movement should stop advocating for large-bodied farm animals altogether at this point?
Thanks. Yeah. I guess what we found is that like ideal campaigns will vary by context. Generally, the good heuristics are obviously like smaller, more numerous animals, but occasionally like larger animals are going to be the most kind of tractable thing people can work on. I think particularly with if you think about different policy windows, like in the UK, you'll have spaces of time where it's much easier to advocate for certain animals over other animals, and there's not really a trade-off between kind of large or small animals. The other thing is, I know I spoke a bit about the small animal replacement problem, but it also occasionally will go the other way in that large animals will have a knock-on effect on other smaller animals. For example, if the insect industry does kind of, if insect farming does launch off over the next kind of decades or years, and this starts getting fed to larger animals, it's a potential, say, like a pig will consume thousands of insects over the course of its life, and then reducing consumption of that or improving welfare conditions to reduce consumption and conditions could have an effect on like many more additional animals beyond the kind of individuals themselves. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't rule out any particular group on kind of one criteria. We're big on making decisions based on, as James was talking about with the research process they use, making decisions based off many different methodologies and not kind of focusing on any one heuristic. Although number of animals is a pretty good heuristic to begin with, yeah.
Thank you so much. Ajdin, you talked about a lot of different intervention techniques. How do you measure the success of these against one another?
Yeah, interesting.
This for Ajdin.
Yeah. Would you like to say though?
But thank you so much.
Yeah, because that's your expertise. So yeah, that's a really good question. We have been asked a lot by various groups of people. So when it comes to the institutional campaigns where we work with restaurants, I think that's pretty self-explanatory that we can measure how many, for example, vegan patties are sold, and that's pretty easy. So I would say it depends really on a place. For example, in city center and in bigger cities, more people are buying vegan burgers than, for example, in smaller cities. That's unfortunately the truth, but I don't know. But when it comes to because we do a lot of public awareness work, I think a lot of us are aware that it's really hard to track, right? It's really hard to measure. I would say really hard to measure rather than track, right? But as Peter Singer said in start, we don't have data that it doesn't work, because like a lot of organizations are doing something because they feel it works, even though like we don't have data for that. But to the data that we have so far is like the public opinion and the media articles. For example, 5 years ago and now they changed a lot. And even we did actually a small experiment in start, because I had an idea to start immediately working with restaurants to include vegan options. And I can remember that in start they weren't really supported that much of it, but now they are. So I believe that all the public awareness work did pay off eventually. So I would say it's not really super measurable, but it works.
Thank you so much. James, can you suggest key KPIs or just how to measure effectiveness of protests for organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question. And I think one way you can pull this out is, I guess, internal versus external metrics. So I think for like a protest like movement, I think internal metrics, i.e. the number of people you have like coming to your events, the number of like committed organizers, the number of local groups, the number of like regular attendees to trainings are all like quite important things that will feed into what I call like rapid response capacity, because that will all signal the breadth and depth of your organization to like mobilize better when things kick off. Otherwise, externally, I think public opinion polls are good, but obviously they're expensive, like will cost several £1,000s, so that's probably not the most viable thing. You can do media mentions. I think at Animal Rebellion we used to track all of our media articles across like national, local, regional, and international news sources, and some tools that we had access to, like it's called Meltwater or Signal AI, supposedly track the reach of your media articles using various like machine learning algorithms. So you could in theory do that, but kind of like Ajdin said, I think it's not straightforward. And I think if you have the scale where you can, public opinion polling or like internal measurements the best way to go. But yeah, I agree. The methodology isn't very good.
Can I just add to this? Like,
Yeah,
same
of
goes
course.
with the Veganuary. Like, we can make a survey about like, will you, or after event, like, will you go vegan or will you change your diet? But we can't for sure know will people do that.
Andres, is your efforts to bring the shrimps better welfare a step in the process of total shrimp liberation, or are you satisfied with high welfare?
Good question. So satisfied, no. That's satisfied, no. But I'm also, I guess, a realist in the sense that there's probably less than a dozen people working worldwide to reduce or improve shrimp welfare, and it is a big problem. It is a several billion-dollar industry. It provides employment to tens of millions of people. So we need to choose our battles, and we are choosing the battle of welfare. And we think that's what's most tractable at the moment. So is there a long theory of change that leads to total liberation of shrimps? I was having a conversation last night about that, and I think there may be, but we are at the moment more narrowly focused on improving welfare. And I know that may be insufficient for some people, but I think it's still a very worthy goal for an ambitious goal in my opinion.
Thank you so much. George, couldn't meat tax extend to chicken meat, justified by pandemic risk?
Yeah, I guess yeah, on that one I can speak precisely on the tax we investigated. It does apply somewhat to chicken because yeah, chicken is will also have environmental effects. It's just like lower. Yeah, in principle, something like that. I can assume chicken will have like a higher risk of pandemics. Yeah, if that's the case and we can weight it towards chicken, this policy would look much more promising. I guess our investigation was particularly into the most likely way this tax would get implemented. Like a lot of the support for meat taxes at the moment comes from environmental groups or people concerned with the health effects. So yeah, if in principle we could weight this towards chicken using arguments like this, the calculus would look different. It's just the kind of tractable or ways it's most likely to get implemented. Even if we're advocating it under this umbrella, I think it's most likely to get implemented in the kind of carbon weighted method.
Thank you so much. Ajdin, how many vegans or vegetarians are in Bosnia according to your survey?
Yeah, so according to the study, it's around 6%. Yeah, but I think we had some like flaws in our studies, so I think the number is slightly less, maybe around 3 or 4%. Yeah, but again, we also did a study about not only vegans but also vegetarians. So yeah, I think it's similar to actually to Croatia and Serbia. The number varies around 3%. So yeah, but that's what our study says so far. We had around 7,000 people.
That's great, thank you. James, do we have an emerging understanding of how disruptive action affects public opinion, assuming it does? For example, does it increase the likelihood of media coverage and therefore raise awareness of the issue? Just in short, if it works, how does it work?
Yeah, I didn't speak about it, but I think that one of the most important factors is media coverage. I think that the largest influence of a protest isn't that people walking around actually see it. It's that it gets international media. You get on like Good Morning Britain, a very famous TV show in England, and then people talk about the issues. So I think most of it is mediated by other factors like media coverage. So I think the reason why disruptive stuff is good is it gets media coverage. If you just stand with placards outside a supermarket, no one cares. But if you dress up as a clown and cover it in blood, everyone's like, what the hell? So things like that, I think, help. So yeah, I think media is very important, basically.
Andrés, your presentation made me think of the work of the working horse welfare organizations, where there's secondary focus on the social benefits of improved animal welfare, like improved worker welfare. Can you see opportunities here?
Good question. I think that's, I guess it wasn't maybe as explicit, but the reason why we've decided to focus on welfare improvements that might also lead, at least not to sacrificing profitability, is that we're convinced that if our advocacy work leads to loss of welfare of these farmers who are barely making ends meet, it will just not be adopted. There is just no mechanism of pressure or change other than voluntary adoption. So I guess we are trying to show the industry that there's a benefit for them. We are trying to show other constituents that there is a benefit in decreasing the level of pathogens that are released into the waterways. But yeah, I think it's very important to link. But as of today, our dialogue is directly with industry, and not because there is a direct dialogue with them to be had. We haven't had to go through other causes, but we do use those because we are convinced that they're important.
Thank you so much. Because we are short on time, that was the last question. Thank you so much once again. And for the last moment, please give a huge round of applause.